Welcome back to another episode of the Daily Flip podcast. I'm your host, Alex, and today we're going to be talking about two great stories. One about carbon capture, the future of this industry, where it's going, what it could mean. In our second article, talking about Mitch McConnell, talking about his legacy, his time as the majority leader in the Senate of the Republican Party, or the party leader, because he was a minority leader at multiple points as well. It's a long legacy, and as it comes to a close here soon, it's something that we definitely have to at least acknowledge and honor. So, with that said, we will also end today with our Daily Delight, a story meant to leave you feeling positive, ready to take on the day. But that's enough rambling for me. Let's jump in to our daily debate. So, for any of my people who are joining here, and it's your first time, we ask a really interesting question most of the time, or sometimes boring questions that I still want the answers to. This one is carbon capture actually a good practice? Does it create a hazard, a moral hazard, where we say, we can capture the carbon that we create, that we emit from all these different processes, whether it be refining metals, whether it be using these carbon fossil fuels as a way to power our society. Does it create a moral hazard actually creating a system that allows us to capture that, because then it feels as though there are little to no repercussions for our actions and we don't actually start curbing it? What is the future of carbon capture look like for you? Would you allow it? Would you stop it? So on and so forth. I think there's a good chunk of my audience that I know what the answer is going to be, but there are always new people coming along and I always want those new perspectives. So, for anyone who's joining for the first time, we have talked about carbon capture before, sometimes in an adjacent way, never had a full article that was all about it. But this is the first time, and I'm going to be honest, it won't be the last, because it is a fascinating topic. And this one actually comes from the New York Times. They did a whole long piece about it. The headline reads, "The New Climate Gold Rush, Scrubbing Carbon from the Sky." So, what is the idea behind carbon capture? Well, CO2 is something that we have been trying to lower the amount of emissions for, but also observing and monitoring in the atmosphere, the stratosphere of Earth for a long time, as we started to notice some possible effects. At first, there's speculation that it might be cooling, and now there's speculation that it might be warming. And I say speculation, a lot of evidence seems to point that way. So there's no doubt that we care deeply about this little, compound that makes it into our atmosphere and affects how we are able to properly and effectively live on this planet. If temperatures continue to rise, we are likely to have lots of our freshwater systems evaporate, meaning we may lose access to water. There will be higher concentrations when that evaporation happens. There will be higher concentrations of salt in the ocean, meaning it will be harder to desalinate. There's other options that you could go for if you're talking about the devastating effects of a warming planet. But the point that I'm trying to get at here is that we have always been focused on the CO2 emissions, and normally we go about trying to mitigate the creation of them in the first place. Well, carbon capture is a practice that will not only allow us to mitigate the creation of them, but after the effect, so therefore capture them after their use, but also eliminate some of our bad decisions. So basically, think about it this way. It's after a bad night out, you don't just have a hangover cure, you magically have a pill that goes back and retroactively is able to remove some of the damage from your liver from the night out. That is what carbon capture would be in theory. We're able to actually take back that carbon that we've been emitting since the 1800s, that extra carbon that is sitting in the atmosphere, we're able to pull it out and we're able to put it to use. And that's something that this article doesn't necessarily go into. It talks about how there's a lot of money going into the carbon capture industry, how Bill Gates and some of these millionaires, billionaires were getting together and talking about the future of carbon capture, the future of environmental policy and business innovation as well. And that is honestly one of the most disappointing things about this article, in my opinion. Because while I like a lot of what they're saying, I like when people shine a light on truly innovative industries that solve problems with creative solutions that allow us to move forward and actually continue to grow, rather than suggesting things that will make us stagnant and stop. Rather than saying, no, we have to cut off all the emissions up to this threshold, or even get rid of all the emissions possible, transition only to environmentally friendly, perfectly environmentally friendly, which doesn't exist, because even windmill solar panels, we have to mine the materials, they disrupt bird patterns. So to pretend as though we're ever going to get out of this cycle of, oh, we have to protect Mother Nature, and we continually find something new that is broken about it, we find something new that our systems interfere with. There's no world in which we are perfectly in tune with Mother Nature, because I say that's not fair. There is a world, but it is nowhere as prosperous or as innovative or as cultivating of knowledge and curiosity as the society that we live in. Not necessarily now, because we can get better, but it's closer to the society we live in now than it is to the ideal world where we stop all of the emissions. The point that I'm getting at, again, I do say the point that I'm getting at, but we need to reshift the focus, is I was sad to hear that they didn't talk about the actual uses of the carbon once you pull it out of the air. Because while pulling it out of the air in order to lower the global temperature is great, that is a philanthropic reason only. It provides no mechanism, no incentive, besides for the companies who want to actually continue emitting and therefore are willing to pay, because there's government regulation telling them that they will have to pay a certain amount of tax credits. They will have to make sure that they offset their carbon in some way, shape, or form. That is not a free market incentive. That is a forced mechanism, a regulation incentive that is put on by the government. The real value in a free market system that will come from this is being able to make carbon fuels, because we have a surplus of carbon now in almost, I don't want to say a pure form, but the stuff that comes from the burn off of these products is purer than when we get it straight from coal and petroleum, because it's burn off. All the other elements have been burned off for the most part. There, obviously there are some chemical bonds that don't necessarily fully dissolve. It does float in the air, but being able to capture this back and possibly make fuels, one of the things that was really fascinating to a really small sub segment of the libertarian anarcho-capitalist side of the internet for a little bit was graphene, and how it's made out of basically a carbon lattice structure, and it's microscopic, and you have to be very particular with how you form it, but it can be extremely strong. It can form structural tubes that we're able to use for surgical operations, for building materials, basically hyper flexible, structurally strong materials that could be used in theory to make space bridges. That was one of the fun theories that I heard about back in the day. But the point being that side of things, whether it be the fuel that we're able to make of it, the compressed diamonds, rather than having to mine natural diamonds out of the ground, you can have the raw carbon and be able to make compressed diamonds if you want to have grown diamonds. So there is a place to sell this stuff off. Also, making of graphene, which is an industry that's being fostered right now and could honestly have an explosion because of the large amounts of carbon that will be able to be pulled out of the atmosphere within the next 40 to 45 years. Now, is it enough to completely offset everything we've done and we will continue to do? No, the industry is in its infant years. There's no doubt about that. So anybody that tells you this is the magic solution, we can just continue to pollute exactly as we have, they're going to get a lot of pushback from environmentalists on that one. But to be naive enough to say, oh, well, we can't even pursue this because it will be a moral hazard, that will encourage people to continue acting in the same way. One, I want to always ask the question when we have this conversation, which is, we are already a nation that has exploited fossil fuels in order to get to where we are. And very often when we go to these climate accords, we say we're going to cut back on our emissions, but we also expect any other nation, third world, second world, I guess now we technically call them global south, whatever framing you want to use, because I really don't care. The point is, we very often say that they need to limit their amount of fossil fuel usage as well. So it's basically, as I've pointed out multiple times when we've had this conversation, it is about approximating you going up the ladder, and then you're pulling up the ladder behind you, saying you don't have access to this resource in order to grow, to stabilize, to bring prosperity to your country. What is one of the greatest, the way to put it, one of the greatest prods, or one of the most productive ways to grow a society healthfully is to provide it with more energy. With more energy, you can do more things. With more cleanly burning fuels, you're less likely to actually lose members of your population, but you're also able to do more with less. Rather than a pound of coal only getting you 5 hours of light for your child to study with, and we're going really basic here, but there are larger scale examples such as industry and movement and all this that we could also go for. But just let's keep it simple so you understand. A pound of coal will probably get you 5 hours of light. That's not an exact metric, but the point being, a pound of oil may be able to get you 6-7 hours of light. Simply the same amount of weight, but the different type of fuel, the more pure burning it is, the better the fuel is, the more efficient you can be with its uses, with the storage of it, the carrying of it, so on and so forth. And with those extra few hours, you don't necessarily have to carry home 1.5 pounds of coal. You don't have to labor yourself on that. We don't have to take up extra storage space because it will probably be a higher volume as well. We can actually more efficiently pack things, which means transport of goods is faster, not only because we have better fuel, but also because of the transporting of the fuel itself, it takes up less space. So you see where I'm coming from here. The use of energy is actually normally pretty commensurate with how the society expands. So we are living in a world where we have to allow the people that we say we want to help access to these resources, this fervent, powerful energy that we've been using for quite some time in order to pick themselves up. And to pull up the ladder behind us is naive, and also it is honestly cruel. So why not, if we made a problem, so to speak, if we were the ones that, and I'm not saying that we're morally liable for this, but in a true environmentalist framework, maybe you could argue, well, we're the ones that brought this carbon apocalypse upon the world, we as the Western society, whatever it may be, then why not be the ones pushing the boundaries in order to actually make the solutions? You could argue that they would probably argue, and I'm trying to be fair, that we are actually benefiting off the problem that we created, and yet the problem we created allowed for the prospering of societies across the entire world. Did it allow the exploitation of them as well? There's no doubt about that. But it also allowed the standard of living across the world to jump in the course of centuries, much faster than it ever had before. It allowed for the more efficient production of food, which has allowed for birth rates to increase, which has allowed for the average IQ to go up, because a lot of IQ, you may have natural IQ in your genetics, but it also comes down to the amount of nutrition food that you are able to consume as a young child and the way that you nurture your body. All of these things are good. To increase the IQ of the population is amazing. To increase the size of the population, though some people in a Malthusian way would argue that it is not okay, especially in certain areas of the world. Overall, the purpose of a biological creature is to basically propagate and continue to grow. So if you want to go by those definitions, then I think that you could definitely say that's a good thing. But also, the more people we have, the more workers we have, the more intellect we have, the more food we have for those people. Therefore, the more intelligence we have, which means the more innovations we can make, which means the better we can make everybody else's life. You can see how it's a knock-on effect here. Obviously, there are arguments against it. But when we look at this as a whole, and the arguments come out from environmentalists that we should not create these systems, it will create a moral hazard. I ask you, is it morally right to restrict the access to the resources that have brought you to the point of seeming prosperity, especially in comparison to the people that are below us? And is it okay and morally right to then say to those people that they will not have the ability to even try to use the resources that you use in order to get where you are? Because, we created a problem and we want to be morally righteous. We want to be above it all. No. What you should do is embrace the fact that we need to cut back so we can leave room for them to grow, but also we create technologies that allow us to offset it. In an ideal world, carbon capture will actually offset the amount of carbon that we put into the air actively. And whether that's from fossil fuels or other systems, this allows us to actually go down an entirely new route of production. So let's think about it this way. And I'm going to get to one or two quotes from here, but honestly, I want you to go read this article yourself, because I was really frustrated when we didn't talk about the possible things that could come out of this. And that's what I think is even more fascinating, to really speculate on what is possible from this innovation. Think about it this way. In a lot of the Western world, it has been shamed or doubted or pushed back against in order to have new energy technologies, new revelations, new innovations that go down a route that would produce large amounts of carbon, which is fair enough. We want to offset it. But that has also led to the prospering of the green energy sector. Great. We love green energy. It's probably going to be the way that we reach a point as a civilization, because you can't necessarily burn fossil fuels all over space. You have to be able to harness the power of the sun. You actually have to be able to synthesize your own fuels with hydrogen, and so on and so forth. The point I'm getting to here is that overall, we are straying away from any potential innovation that is down a certain path. So let's say there are two paths. There's the green energy path and the carbon path. We are actively divesting from the carbon path and going the green energy path. Why can't we do both? Well, we can't do both because there are people that are pressuring against the carbon dioxide path, the path that has more carbon involved, because of the negative ramifications of those actions. Fair enough. That is actually what a responsible society does. Then we should also develop the technology that allows us to offset our previous mistakes, but also allows us to continue down that path of innovation. Why would you not want to have multiple energy sources? Why would you not want to develop both of these paths? To pretend as though we have to dogmatically follow on the green energy path and not create a way to make the carbon path viable while also not destroying our planet is naive, and it is dogmatic. And this is what we need to focus on. This is why I like talking about these issues, because they go beyond just the cool innovation, the marketability, the money that's getting thrown that way. These are larger conversations about what we want to be as a species. Do we want to be a dogmatic species that holds true to what is comfortable, what is safe, or do we want to be one that continually innovates, pushes boundaries, understands that we can make mistakes, but not just make the mistakes and go forward? That would be the carbon path with no solution without cutting back. No. We should be a society that takes those risks, understands the consequences, and then not only lives, but corrects those consequences and actually takes responsibility for what they're doing. I think that as a society, that is a proper path. I think that's how I want a lot of people to model their lives. I think that as a overarching human trait, so to speak, is way more beneficial than the let things be as they be in harmony with what is, rather than aspiring to what could be, because that is what, as far as we are aware, that is what makes us human beings. That is what makes us different. We have an understanding of time, but also we have the ability to project into the future and plan for it. We have the ability to conceptualize what the future looks like. We don't know if other animals are able to do this, and I honestly believe that our ability to do that is either brought about by our consciousness, or it is a trait that allows consciousness to develop. But this is something that we have as human beings that truly seems to make us unique in this world. And to give it up and rather live a complacent life of reaction rather than one aspiring and actually looking forward, trying to grasp what we see in front of us and what we want to build, that is beautiful. It is aspirational. It will drive change. It will continue to live in the gut of human beings forever. It will be the fire that pushes us forward into new lands, new technologies. And sure, we're going to stumble, but to pretend as though you're not going to stumble in life anyway is idiotic. To pretend as a society is not going to stumble anyway is idiotic. And to live in a world of complacency is only going to drive people insane, in my opinion. Then again, I'm not saying that the environmental worldview is just that, complacency. No, they actually have a call to action, which is fixing the environment. I'm not trying to say that it is simply one or the other, or that those two are how they are presented now. But I will tell you now that I feel as though limiting ourselves destroying one path of progress because it doesn't fit into a narrative, there are those out there that will just dogmatically follow through on that line of thinking rather than acknowledging. Some environmentalists in here have acknowledged that we need to do both. Some environmentalists in this article said, no, it's a boondoggle. It's not going to get us anywhere. Fair enough. That's your opinion. But I feel as though that is dogmatically sticking to the party line, which is anything that would allow this moral hazard, basically, is something that we should not pursue. I feel as though that is small-minded. I feel as though that is someone who is trapped in their bubble. And they could be right that this technology won't work out. Fair enough. And that's why maybe we do have to start curbing some of our emissions while we still figure out how this technology can be useful. But to pretend as though I can sit here and tell you that, oh yes, this technology may fail, so we're not going to actually do anything. We're basically just going to continue on our path of cutting down on all emissions. It feels as though I would be saying to you, just sit back and relax, and we're going to slowly cut those emissions. We're not going to try to actually pursue something that enables us to move forward in the most efficient, productive manner. It's not the way forward that it would be me saying, no, we can just have one path forward. There's only one right way to go. That is idiotic. That is naive. And I just can't stand for it. This is the environmental issue. I love our planet. I do not want our planet to die. I don't want it to be overheated for my children or my grandchildren. I don't want them to grow up in an era where water is sparse and they have to fight in order to survive or even to have a drink of water on a daily basis. I don't want any of those things to happen. I don't want a large number of mammals, insects, fish, any given organism, plants. I mean, the Amazon's a great example. I don't want any of them to die out needlessly because everything in our ecological system has a place. There's no doubt about that. But to also pretend as though that we are the same, that we can give up our own prosperity in order to sacrifice for these other things, that one is extremely small-minded in that it doesn't allow for us to be able to grow, learn, repair, and solve these issues, which I think we are capable of as human beings. But also, it's to say as though there's nothing special about us. And if there's nothing special about us and we are simply mechanisms of the universe barreling forward simply by the actions that have propelled us here, the atoms that hit before us, that is extremely nihilistic, that is extremely cynical. It's basically determinism. It removes any free will. And I do not adhere to that worldview. So thank you for joining me for that one. If you actually want to go read the article, because I ended up ranting about the article around the article, there's one or two parts in the very first section where they talk about the amount of investment, the people that were actually at this summit that was hosted by Bill Gates. One of the other ones that we've actually talked about before is some of the other projects where they talk about brightening clouds, making them more reflective, or releasing sulfur dioxide into the atmosphere, or genetically altering bacteria in order to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. I would read that one mainly because I've talked about it before, and I believe especially the spraying sulfur dioxide or reflective sunlight away with more dense clouds. While I think the technology is fascinating, I think that is extremely arrogant. And the reason I say that versus the carbon equation is we don't know what brightening the clouds looks like artificially. We don't know what spraying sulfur dioxide will do artificially. We have some semblance of what the Earth looked like with less carbon in it before. Then again, moving forward, we will also have to realize we also put other toxic chemicals into the atmosphere, and we can't simply just remove carbon because it is one of the largest greenhouse gases and it has one of the largest effects. But there are other things that we put in there. So if we actually remove too much carbon and there's another mix of extra nitrogen or maybe some other chemicals that I don't know off the top of my head, we do have to be careful about that, and we do have to be arrogant. We have to be wary of how arrogant we can be playing God, no doubt. But we at least have some semblance of what less carbon looks like because we've lived through it for the most part, and our ancestors lived through it as well. All these other things are adding rather than subtracting. In this case, the carbon dioxide is subtracting what we have actually put in to the system versus these other examples where we're adding another variable to the system. So, but hey, that's, like I said, you can go read that yourself. It's absolutely fascinating. Also, the article talks about all the different venture funds that are getting involved, all the different projects, whether it be in Switzerland, Sweden, Iceland, the one in California, there's one in Canada as well. It is absolutely fascinating, and there's a coalition of companies that are getting behind it. So I would go read it for sure. But with that said, we've talked about the climate, and wow, that took, like I said, way longer than I thought it would. But it's okay, because this next one doesn't need to take up all the time in the world. It is an article that comes from the Washington Free Beacon. Headline reads, "McConnell's record is nothing to snort at." And this author is actually going through a biography that was written about Mitch McConnell. It's called The Price of Power. I think I'm definitely going to buy this book. I want to get around to this book within the year of 2025, because he is obviously retiring from the majority position, the majority leader position, or the minority leader position, because right now it's a minority leader. In the time that it's 2025, it will be a majority leader, at least underneath Donald Trump. So the point I'm getting at, though, is he's retiring from that position, and he has had a storied career. A lot of people give him credit now for the judicial appointments, and while I think that is 100% fair, I honestly think it's more impressive keeping together, more or less, a Republican coalition, in any given coalition, whether it be Chuck Schumer or Nancy Pelosi. Whether or not you like Nancy Pelosi, whether or not you like Mitch McConnell, you cannot deny that both of them are relatively effective at keeping their groups, their subdivisions, their internal battles that happen in these parties underneath the surface and locked in. They keep their parties on message for the most part. Obviously, there's examples where it's not the case, but McConnell has been able to rally the Senate Republicans on multiple instances, just as Nancy Pelosi was able to rally the House Democrats. Chuck Schumer is also, to some degree, been able to do it, though there was a little bit of defiance there from Sinema and Manchin, and then even Fetterman for a little bit with some of the Israel stuff. So the point I'm getting at here is it is a storied career. And to pretend as though a man who came out of, not nowhere Kentucky, but came out of Kentucky and went on to be the most senior, most influential member of the United States Senate, representing the Republican Party when it was not an easy time growing up, to pretend as though that story is not worth listening to, it is not something that, one, shows the absolute drive and passion, political ambition, Machiavellian politics of Washington, but also of this man particularly. I think that would be a disservice to him to honestly deny him the privilege of bringing this sort of thing up. Like I said, whether or not you like him, you can't deny that he is good at what he does. Now, I do want to read one excerpt here because I think it's fascinating with how the book was intended to start. Quote, Michelle Tackett's new biography of McConnell, The Price of Power, is an important contribution to understanding our political landscape and recognizing McConnell's vast talents. This is so even though Tackett is not a political fan of his subject. The book praises McConnell reluctantly, which makes the survey of his impact even more impressive. Tackett disapproves of how McConnell has helped reshape the Supreme Court, fill the judiciary, get Republican senators elected, reduce taxes, and combat efforts to have the government impose more rules on campaign financing. Nevertheless, Tackett writes, McConnell, quote, is a master of talent, scouting, opportunism, of planning and execution in the business of politics, and where winning is the measure of success, end quote. And that is high praise. For someone who does not like McConnell, that is high praise. So I'm not necessarily saying you go out and buy the book. I'm not saying we're going to do a book club, but I think it'd be a fascinating read. And I have spent more time recently with people from Kentucky who actually deeply admire the man, and I've worked with them before, and some of them, and everybody makes jokes about the man. There's no doubt about that. I've heard the jokes whether I'm on the street, whether it's on YouTube, whether it's on social media, whether it is out in the streets in Kentucky, Tennessee, DC. People make jokes about McConnell. They talk about the geriatric society, and yet there is a reverence when they talk about his achievements, whether Democrat or Republican. And when I say a reverence, if it's a Democrat, there's a reverence with, gosh, that McConnell was just getting this thing done. There is still a reverence even when they're hating on what he did, versus the Republican who does say that he was affirming these decisions. He was actually able to keep the coalition together. There's a reverence in those words as well. So like I said, the book is called The Price of Power. There is a subheading as well, but The Price of Power, you can just look up Price of Power McConnell. You'll definitely find it. I think it will be an interesting one, and I want to at least give him his flowers before we get to the point where he will no longer be the majority leader. So also with that, now that we got all that stuff out of the way, we're going to jump into our Daily Delight. This one, like I said earlier, is meant to leave you basically with a smile on your face, or at least giggling a little bit. So this one today comes from our friends over at Animals Around the Globe. And it is an article talking about how a member of the media team over at one of these local channels was watching a video of a great white. It's one of the biggest great whites I've ever seen. And it is, I watched the video and the anchorman's just sitting there, mouth open. What? That thing looks like an elephant in the water. It is honestly impressive how big this shark is. No doubt that this great white is one of the biggest that I've ever seen, and I share the man's astonishment, and I think it's worth not just hearing about it, not just hearing about the slack jaw, the man confused as to what to say, but actually going and watching this one. So if you want to do that, or you want to read the article that I took very few quotes from, or the one that I did do some quotes from, because they also have a link to the book there, all of the articles will be linked in the description below that like and subscribe button. Also down there, you can find the podcast on Spotify, Pocket Cast, Podvine, as well as the Twitter handle at Your Daily Flip, where I post a Twitter tirade every Tuesday and Thursday. So with all that said, there is only one more thing to say. Actually, I'm kidding, because 6 and 6 also comes out on Tuesday and Thursday. That's over here at the YouTube channel, the RSS feed. It is 6 stories from around the world in 6 minutes or less. It is international news, but it's meant to be quick and consumable. So now with all that out of the way, we can say there's only one more thing to say. Stay safe. Don't die.